So I want to greet everybody. Thank you so much for joining Grand Piano Series once again for the pre-concert talk. We're thrilled to have Mark Travis come back and talk us through the fantastic program that we're going to be hearing on March 9th, this Wednesday. And hopefully we can see all of you as well as many others at the concert because it's going to be really special. So Mark, I'll let you take the baton. Thanks.
Thank you, Milana, and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mark Travis, and I'm a longtime friend of Milana and Raniero, and have been a friend of the Grand Piano Series for a few years as well. And it's always a pleasure to have this opportunity to talk about music and to hopefully share a few insights into some of what will be performed, not just the music itself, but also the composers and maybe, a little historical context as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and give us a few visual aids here. And so once again, as Milana mentioned, for anybody that's watching on stream or on YouTube, we're talking about a wonderful program of chamber music by really three high caliber artists of our time. This will be at the St. Leo Catholic Church in Bonita Springs, Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. www.grandpianoseries.com is where you go for your tickets. And I think a few good seats are still available for that. So in discussing what I love, as someone who works with large orchestras and opera companies a lot, the chance to return to chamber music is a pleasure. And I think that's true of musicians as well. There are very few musicians that I know who don't really cherish the opportunity to play chamber music together, because it's a different thing. It's different than a soloist. It's different than large ensemble because of the intimacy that you're able to create and kind of the way that 2 or 3 or 4 people can really come together as one and express this vision. And, it opens up, because it's a smaller ensemble, it opens up to, greater interpretive possibilities sometimes. So it's really an exciting thing to be a part of, I think, both as a musician and as an audience member. It's a real privilege to kind of sit in and see friends make music together. The other thing that I really enjoy is that sometimes it exposes some repertoire and brings about, composers that we might not otherwise see, just because of what their particular output was. And we kind of begin this recital with music by someone that is certainly well known to anyone who is a devotee of the violin, but might not be as well known to a more casual music hobbyist. And that's the great Belgian virtuoso Eugenie Sailly. He lived from 1858 until 1931. He was a triple threat as a conductor, a composer, and as a violinist. He's often referred to as the quote-unquote king of the violin, and another great violinist by the name of Nathan Milstein later dubbed him the czar of the violin. He's well known for kind of this idea of, in violin playing, of don't always vibrate, but always be vibrating. So in other words, he really talked a lot about the technique of the instrument in such a way that emphasized a complete approach, emphasized every sound that the violin was capable of making and being prepared to make any of those sounds at any particular point in time. He really did revolutionize the way that people thought about the instrument. He's one of those pivot figures, I think, in the violin, in the same way that Franz Liszt was as a pianist, and of course, Beethoven and Mozart before him. So Sailly was known to be a great interpreter of the music of his contemporaries. Over 200 works are dedicated to him, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, it gives some sense of just how celebrated he was as an interpreter and as a performer during his time. And he is perhaps best known for the music of Saint-Saëns and César Franck, Max Bruch. In fact, I can tell you, Ysaÿe made his New York Philharmonic debut in the Scottish Fantasy by Max Bruch. But he also really brought a lot to more standard, or at least what was then more standard fare. It's all standard repertoire now, in the music of Beethoven and of Johann Sebastian Bach. Sir Henry Wood said of him, too, that, whenever he stole time from one note, Ysaÿe would faithfully pay it back within 4 bars. And, what this kind of refers to is that he wasn't just this virtuoso who was stepping out on stage and expecting his accompanist to follow him. Quite the contrary. He was able to find those moments where he could rejoin, but he could still have some expressive freedom. And that is really a gift. If you have an accompanist who can keep up with you, as a singer, or really any other, as a player of any instrument, that's a real gift. You don't let that relationship go dim. But I think when both parties are equally great musicians and have that ability to find each other, that's a real sign of greatness. That's something special, and that's something that Ysaÿe was said to have been able to manage. So we're going to hear his Sonata for Solo Violin in D minor, subtitled Ballade, Opus 27, number 3. This is actually one of 6 sonatas that he wrote in 1924. The inspiration was attending the recital of another great violinist, Szigeti, who was playing music of Bach. And so it occurred to Ysaÿe that, what would happen, in that same way that Bach would cover the dimensions, the contrapuntal capabilities, the tonality that was possible of the keyboards available to him at his time. What would happen if somebody did that with the violin and, tried to celebrate kind of the evolution of violin technique as it stood in the early 20th century, in the 1920s? And so this is one of 6 pieces. Each of those 6 pieces was dedicated to another great violinist of the time. This particular one was dedicated to George Enescu, great Romanian composer and violinist. Another one was dedicated to Szigeti. Another was dedicated to Heifetz. I don't have in front of me who the other 3 were. They weren't quite the household names that those other 3 are to us now. But the idea was not only to dedicate them, but then to kind of reflect a little bit of their playing. And so, with this piece, with Enescu really being one of the better known Romanian composers, period, he uses, multi-voice textures, contrapuntal devices, this simultaneous melody and accompaniment that is really indicative of, Eurasian or, Eastern European music of that time. And, it sounds plausibly like something Enescu probably would have played or improvised or written himself. And it's cast in a single movement that unfolds in 2 sections. I kind of think of it as it's a lot like an aria, really. The opening very much like a recitative, and then we sort of have the the big tunes that come a little bit later. Now, in thinking about, I try to avoid as much as possible when putting talks together to invite any direct comparison with solo artists. Occasionally, there's compelling reason to do so, but I thought instead, for today, because Ysaÿe did do some recording, I thought it would be interesting to hear him. He didn't, to the best of my knowledge, ever record any of the violin sonatas, but we do have him in a mazurka. And so, Milana, if you could bring up that first excerpt. Now, I'll just say, I mean, this is a very old recording from the 1910s, so you might have to boost your volume at home as you listen. But let's just hear, a few seconds just to get a sense of the purity and clarity of his playing, even as expressed in this, old recording technology. That's probably good, Milana. Thank you. So even with this older technology, you really get a sense of just how much he moved, and kind of this. His playing is always described as, pure in spirit, and it really is. He was unique. Let's also then, Milana, bring up just a little bit. I thought we should hear our artist, and so we don't have her in this work, but let's hear just a little bit of her in music by an Isaïe friend and contemporary, Camille Saint-Saëns. Yeah, I think that's good. Thank you, Milana. So again, we are going to be treated to just a wonderful interpreter and someone who definitely inhabits this world that Isaïe is conjuring for us in this sonata. And so definitely in for a real treat. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen now, and let's talk. Oops. There we go. About the next composer, Carl Maria von Weber. And Carl Maria von Weber is one of those composers who doesn't turn up so often, but I'm always happy when he does. He lived from 1786 to 1826, and he was a composer, a conductor, a pianist. I love the fact that he played the guitar, being one of my main instruments as well, and a critic. And I can tell you, he was a very good guitarist. He actually wrote some really lovely serenades. If you want to go on a little spree through any of the music sites or on YouTube, you can find some really, really charming works for voice and guitar that were written by Weber. He was, a lot of what he did was about the human voice. He was a very key figure in the development of German Romantic opera, in particular, pieces like Der Freischütz and Oberon, remain repertoire staples to this day, especially in Europe. And he, was a huge influence on later composers, in particular, Giacomo Meyerbeer, and of course, Richard Wagner as well, for the way that he just kind of added a little extra gravitas and romantic spin, to the German opera repertoire. And kind of a fun fact, I think, is that he was actually a cousin of Mozart's wife, Costanza. Her father was Weber's father's half brother. And so how what sort of cousin that ends up being, but they were relatives. And I think it's just one of the things that is interesting as we, look at music and finding those connections that, a lot of these great composers and great musicians really did inhabit the same world and, walked in similar circles. So it's interesting to see. We're going to hear a work which I would argue is probably Weber's, probably certainly one of his best known works. Outside of his operatic contributions. Of course, he did write, he had some very charming solo piano works and a concerto as well. But this Grand Duo Concertante for clarinet and piano, Opus 48, is definitely something that, if there are any clarinetists in your life, this piece, is going to come up at some point in time. It was a piece that even in my early career as a classical music presenter, we loved this kind of piece because it has some interesting textures. It's a good length for radio, and and it's beautiful. And so it's a treat when you have this opportunity to hear it live. It was written over the course of 1815 and 1816. And what's perhaps, a big attraction of this work, I think, to players, is that this isn't just the clarinet with a piano going chuck 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 chuck. This is virtuoso writing for both instruments. The great violinist Paganini used to travel about, and he and this guitarist would give these recitals. And the accompanist at some point said to him, you always, you get all the glamour, you get all the glory, taking the violin part. Why don't you, let me play the violin next time and you play the guitar, you be the accompanist. And so Paganini said, sure, no problem. And, wrote some new music, in which case the violin soloist was left going chuck 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 as Paganini played some of the most difficult guitar music ever written. So it's a difficult give and go sometimes. So when you can find a piece that truly honors both players, or all players, it's definitely it stands out. So this really a challenge for both the clarinetist and for the pianist and clarinet. Yes. And interesting, the movements were composed out of sequence. So movements 2 and 3 actually are written after. And just the title, we think that he was going to probably write a sonata or something, but stopped short of that with this title of Grand Duo, really wanting to showcase that this was something special. This is something that was going to be new and different. So, and one other thing, Weber had a clarinet muse for much of his career named Heinrich Beermann. But this piece, we think, pretty sure, was actually written for a different clarinetist named Johann Simon Hermstedt. Hermstedt was very famous from Beethoven circles and Louis Spohr circles. So, it's interesting that, maybe Weber just wanted a little more objective distance, in having this work performed by someone else. It's difficult to say, but it does stand out in that way as well. So we actually do have a recording, not of the version for clarinet and piano as you'll hear it, and that's how it was conceived. This is a version that's adapted for soloist and chamber orchestra, but it does feature our soloist. And Milana, if you would, just for audio purposes, if you could bring that up next so we can just hear a taste of the Grand Duo. And that's probably enough to illustrate our purpose, Milana. Thank you. So you hear just in the sweetness of that voicing, you know, even if you've never heard Weber's operatic music, I think you could probably gather in that same way that if you hear a Mozart adagio, you know, you can sort of see that, yeah, you know, if that's what the person can do for a clarinet, what could they do for the human voice? You know, really managing to have that singing quality present in their music. So yeah, it's always pleases me when you have a chance to say a few words about Weber, and I think you'll really enjoy having him, you know, present on this recital. I'm going to share again and talk a little bit about our next. So then we move to very familiar territory for the grand piano series in music of Chopin. Chopin lives from 1810 to 1849, passes away far too young from tuberculosis, but was actually surrounded by many friends and family and, you know, people he loved in his final days, which didn't happen so often, you know, especially in that era. He, of course, was a matchless virtuoso pianist, rivaled perhaps only by Franz Liszt during his time, but very different artists in their approach and philosophy. Certainly remains one of the most celebrated of Polish musicians and composers to this very day. And one interesting kind of quirk about Chopin is that he preferred to play the piano in the dark. And I think even for public performances, very often the rooms were dimmed a little bit more. That was his preference. But something about that just really appealed to him, you know, and he too was someone who, you know, was a prodigy and poet in early life. And so, you know, I don't know, to me, it sort of adds to this mysterioso of his character. We're going to hear a piece that we've heard a few times on the Grand Piano series, and with, you know, great reason. It's an amazing piece of music, the Fantasy in F minor, Opus 49. It was composed in 1841. It is rightly so among the composer's most revered works, certainly among the composer's longest as well, at least for solo piano. And what does that title mean? What does fantasy mean? Well, in this case, you know, even in the Romantic era, when music is becoming denser, thicker textures, being driven by poetic ideas a little bit more, there was still a lot of convention. And so there was still this expectation that for the most part, you were going to stick with sonata allegro form, you know, for any formal composition. You might write an etude, even that would, you know, probably at its heart be in sonata allegro form. So the idea of noting that it's a fantasy, it expresses this desire for Chopin to kind of be unfettered from, you know, any rules, and to instead just express what was on his mind and what was in his heart, you know, as he is, you know, probably beginning with just improvisations and then, you know, later adapting this work for piano. And we do happen to have a recording of our soloist, Jon Nakamatsu, performing this piece. So let's just get a little taste of that, Milana, if you could bring that up, please. leave off there, Milana, please. So, I mean, imagine what that's going to sound like live and in person and on a Fazioli. That's going to be a really spectacular opportunity to hear one of the great works of the piano literature by a very original artist performed on a very special instrument. Then we move from here. I'll share my screen again to music by one of my favorite composers, Aram Khachaturian. Now, Khachaturian is, come on, there we go. Khachaturian is almost a direct contemporary of Dmitri Shostakovich. He lives 1903 to 1978. Shostakovich's dates, I think, are 1905 to 1975, maybe 76. And they certainly knew each other well and very similar to Shostakovich. Khachaturian was someone who, fell in and out of favor with the Soviet government during his time. Initially he was praised and brought out as a hero and lauded for his efforts, but then he was accused, much as Prokofiev and Shostakovich were, of something called formalism, which really meant that they were writing music that was too weird for lack of, to really oversimplify it. Music that wasn't immediately accessible and useful to the party at that time. But it was something that would happen for a time, and then something else would happen, and then he'd be back in favor. So an interesting figure of our time. He was both a composer and a conductor. And these days, I think for the, person that listens to classical radio and goes to concerts, he might be best remembered for his ballet scores. Certainly a piece like the Saber Dance, from Gaina. That's where I think we tend to hear him and encounter him a little bit more often. But certainly, some really magical works for larger orchestral forces and concertos as well. A really dynamic flute and violin concerto. It's the same piece, but voiced for different instruments. And Khachaturian also stands out in that he was probably, at the time anyway, the most prominent Armenian composer. And that was... He really leaned into his Armenian heritage a lot over the course of his time. We hear quite a bit of Armenian folk motifs and rhythms and melodic structure in his music, though by birth, he was born in Georgia, in Europe, not in the United States. But we're going to hear his trio in G minor for clarinet, violin, and piano. This piece was composed in 1932. He would have been about 29 years old at the time. He's still actually a student, like basically maybe our equivalent of a performer's certificate level student in Moscow. And this very texture of violin, piano, and clarinet is a little bit interesting. Very often, a lot of the big clarinet trios that we hear usually feature a string instrument in a lower voice, either viola or cello. But in having the violin here, it really does lend itself to kind of, again, doing what Khachaturian was able to do in blending East and West sensibilities with these textures, that have similar registers but very different textures, and he really takes advantage of that in this piece. Again, one of very few pieces that he really wrote for more intimate forces. So we have a small chamber ensemble here from Israel, and Milana, if you could play just a little moment or two of that, I would be much obliged. That's probably enough for our purposes, Milana. Thank you. So just a little taste of this chamber work by Khachaturian, where, again, you can hear that, there's certainly some kind of folk dance qualities to it. It reminds me a lot, frankly, of kind of similar works by Enescu or Bartok or Kodai, some of the other, composers who really, for whom folk music was an essential part of their oeuvre. We then go to a piece that also tries to suggest this world in that Cigane by Maurice Ravel. And I'll share my screen again. Say a few words about him. Ravel, is a very well-known composer to many of us, I think. And he lived from 1875 to 1937. Revered, of course, as a composer and a pianist, but he was also a master orchestrator. That's something that takes a very special talent. And as we think about, great figures in music history, that's a distinction that does come up from time to time. Chances are you might occasionally see a Ravel piece that was, say, written for piano, arranged for bassoon, but you don't really see a tendency in his orchestral works for there to be revision. Unlike, say, a composer like Modest Mussorgsky, whose music we almost only know because of the adaptations and editing and orchestration that someone like Ravel did. So it was a really, it was his superpower, I guess, was orchestration, along with his, gift of melody. From time to time, you hear him called an impressionist composer. He and Debussy are probably the closest that Western music ever got to that, but a lot of musicologists and historians and other people who talk about music don't really like that term as expressed in music, but you hear it from time to time nevertheless. So I think it's important to at least acknowledge, certainly from the time period, you can understand why people would want to call some of this music impressionistic. Another thing that, given what I do for a living, or part of what I do for a living, that I admire about Ravel is that he was a really early advocate for recording technology. He really recognized that this could be a great tool for artists and composers to be able to get their music out there and get their music heard. And he took it upon himself to, supervise certain sessions, during his lifetime to make sure that those recordings were good enough, so we could probably add, producer after his title of, pianist and composer and orchestrator, because he really did see those possibilities. So this work, Cigane, is, it would translate to a word that, is problematic, I think, in 2022, referring to the Roma people. But it's not so much supposed to be a reflection of the Roma people, but really a more generic term to imply that the music being heard is going to be a little on the exotic side, at least to Western ears at that time, in terms of both the rhythmic structure and the harmony. Notably, this piece was commissioned by and written for a great Hungarian virtuoso by the name of Zseli Darányi, and she was in turn a niece of the great Joseph Joachim. Joachim, if that's a name that you've heard or not, maybe you haven't heard before, Joachim was really a great muse of a lot of the late romantic violinists and composers, notably Brahms and Max Bruch, premiering their works and working with them to help forge. So that's a really amazing connection. We do actually have a recording of Jennifer playing this piece. So Milana, let's have just a little, I'm sorry for that. Just a little taste of that, please.
Mark, I actually don't have this. I didn't get the link. So if you want to try to do it with your No, we don't hear it. But I found the recording, so I'll just share my screen. One moment.
All right. Yeah, I think that's enough to kind of just give us a little flavor of the world that's being occupied by Ravel in this piece. I mean, that was another real gift of Ravel, is that, you know, in a sense, he brought the idea. I think Ravel kind of helped set the table in a way for later efforts by people like Bartók and by Khachaturian, in that he at least started to test ears and get them used to thinking about some different harmonies, even if they were, you know, Eastern harmonies through a Western music lens, if you will. That's something that really was a distinction of the final composer on our program. And I'll share a screen for a final time. Bela Bartók, is that, you know, Bartók, we celebrate, you know, not only was he an amazing, you know, pianist and composer for his time, but he really and truly was one of the first that didn't try to kind of civilize the music that he would collected, the folk music, you know, from his native regions, you know, in and around Transylvania and Hungary and you know, other nations in that part of the world. He really kind of tried to find ways to work those true rhythms and harmonies into his music, and then also worked tirelessly, you know, along with Zoltán Kodály, to try and preserve and collect a lot of these folk melodies and songs and traditions. You know, we really owe a great debt of gratitude to him for the work that he did. You know, also somebody that really took advantage of, you know, the emerging recording technology that was available to him, you know, where he wasn't just trying to transcribe things, but really wanted to preserve them as they were, you know, without any question. And that's a real gift that he did, you know, in his travels, you know, kind of preserving these, you know, songs by, you know, smaller tribes and groups of people that might have otherwise been lost to us. And, you know, of course, his whole output, you know, is this really unique synthesis of Eastern and Western harmonies and techniques. And certainly some of his earlier music, you know, reflects less of that. But I think it was a constant. You know, he probably leans a little more heavily into it in his middle period, and then his later works, for a variety of reasons, you know, kind of finds a little bit more of a balance, I suppose. You know, he knew he was dying. He knew he needed a couple of pieces that were going to leave a legacy behind for his family, quite frankly. So we're going to hear his contrasts for clarinet, violin, and piano. Contrast is a perfect word, you know, because just as described in thinking about this combination of violin and clarinet and piano when discussing Khachaturian, the same idea is present here in this work by Bartók. And Bartók really leans into the differences of those textures and the differences in the worlds each instrument occupies. Interestingly enough, this work was commissioned by the great Benny Goodman and the violinist Joseph Szigeti. And the idea was actually for the three of them to do the premiere of the piece. They did not do the premiere, to the best of my knowledge, but they did actually make a recording of it, which we'll try and hear just a little taste of before we wrap up. One thing I'll say is that at least the outer movements of this piece are based on military recruitment dances in the first and third movement. The first, in particular, is a piece that really would have been used to kind of entice young men to join the military at the time. And then the third is a little bit more of like an actual initiation into that. They're about ready to sign on the dotted line, and hey, let's do this dance. And next thing you know, we're all going to be brothers in arms in a little while, or in service. So another point of this piece is that it actually requires two instruments for both the clarinet and the violin. Now, for the clarinet or any wood instrument, that's not so uncommon. I mean, it's unusual, but it's not so uncommon. But I think the clarinetist has to have both a B flat and a instrument. But then the violinist actually has to have two instruments available as well. One of them in standard tuning and one in kind of a alternate tuning to illustrate and achieve some of what Bartók is looking to achieve. So with that said, Milana, if you can, let's have just a little bit of the contrasts for violin, clarinet, and piano. Okay, yeah, that's probably a good place to end. So, what a treasure it is! What I know I've said it before, and I'll probably say it dozens of more times. What we wouldn't give to be able to hear Mozart, play the piano, or to hear Liszt, play his own transcendental etudes. It's such a gift that we do have these recordings available to us by these, great artists, that we continue to revere. And, just knowing that that's available, if you're interested in more, a lot of those recordings are pretty easy to find. Some of them in even, nice remastered versions. It doesn't, it's not magic. It doesn't completely take care of all the scratchiness and what have you, but maybe it adds just a little bit more clarity, and I think it is very informative when we can go back to the source and hear how they were interpreting the work. Not that that should limit what we do, but it can be extremely informative, I think. So thank you again. I really hope that you'll all enjoy this recital on Wednesday. What a terrific opportunity to hear a nice body of solo and chamber music in a place with a nice acoustic and an amazing piano, and performed by really top level artists. So thank you as always for letting me be with you and talk a little bit about this stuff.
Thank you so much, Mark. Do you have a few minutes for questions, just in case?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If anybody has any questions for Mark, today we don't have any guest artists. They are busy artists and they're working hard. So some of them are traveling today. So today we only have Mark. And if you have any questions about the program, or for me, for that matter, I'll be happy to answer them. Anybody? You can either raise your hand and mute yourself. I mean, no questions. Great. Then I'm looking forward to
Great.
looking forward to seeing you all on Wednesday. I see that most of the people are going to be there, ticket holders. And if you don't have tickets yet, I'm talking to our online audience who will be listening to this afterwards. We encourage you to join us for a live performance. There is no substitute for a live concert experience. And we really hope to see you there. Thank you, Mark, so much. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.